G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy for the Round 5 edition of Just the Tips. It was a bit of a sorry week last week for me in terms of tipping. It started really well, got the margin correct between Collingwood and Carlton. Can't remember what I said in the video, but sometimes I put a different margin into the actual app because I don't really think too much about it. Went with 17, got that correct. It was all going so well until North Melbourne played Sydney, and that may be my worst tip in a long time. Now, I've done some bad tips of tipping West Coast over the last 4 years, so if we put those aside, outside of that, that might be the worst tip I've done in some time. The other incorrect tips I got were St Kilda upsetting Port Adelaide in Adelaide. I'm not massively surprised that St Kilda was good enough to win, but I'm probably a little bit surprised that Port Adelaide has been so poor to start this year. So I got that wrong, and I think a lot did. And I didn't back Fremantle. I went for the Western Bulldogs in that game at Optus Stadium. A great performance from Fremantle. And yeah, just generally speaking, just ruined my tips. I got 3 out of the last 4 wrong. So we'll go through the weekly winners and then get into round 5. So we'll shout out 2 winners who got perfect tips this week. DKB91 and Shady got 8 with a correct margin as well, which is very, very impressive. That puts the tipping leader as Shady this week with 30 correct tips and a margin of 71. And Dane Begovic is our fantasy competition leader with an average of 18.72. I only recently found out that you're only getting best 18 in the fantasy because of the buys. That just shows how ignorant I am. Somebody told me that. That would explain why my scores have been low. But nonetheless, well done, Dane. As always, guys, the links to all these competitions are still in the description of these videos, so you can absolutely still join. Okay, we're back on Squiggle for round 5, Adelaide versus Geelong. It's gather round, of course. And what a great way to kick off gather round. As I had a look at the head-to-head between these two sides, Adelaide hasn't actually beaten Geelong at Adelaide Oval that much recently, but you factor in Adelaide has been through a fairly lengthy rebuild, and the Cats are generally a strong team. I think the last time Adelaide won at Adelaide Oval was 2021, and I do wonder if, I certainly think they should go into this game as favourites. They've been one of the best teams in the comp in the first 4 rounds, had one difficult opponent and fell short by 1 point. And, lots has been said about the fact that maybe Rankin should have had a free kick to at least equal the score late in the game. I'll leave that to other people for now. But it was a great game between two sides that I think could be the real deal in 2025. So certainly wouldn't take anything away from the Crows for losing that game. They still look red hot. And the Cats have been a little bit lackluster, at least to what my expectations were of them this year. But they do sometimes start slowly, or they have a form slump at some point. I'm still convinced they will definitely play finals this year. Nonetheless, they sit 2-2. And I suppose we're challenged a little bit more by Melbourne than I expected. Now, to be honest, that game probably could have been a little bit more one-sided in terms of the scoreboard by the end of it. But I still think Geelong are probably still getting into gear for season 2025. And Adelaide are red hot. So with that all being said, I think Adelaide at home could win this significantly. I'm going to tip them by a healthy 30 points. Collingwood versus Sydney might be the toughest game to tip this week. I'm not sure if I'll say it's game of the round, but it's probably the least easy to predict, in my opinion. Collingwood had, I suppose, a little bit unconvincing win over Carlton. The game was in tough conditions, overcame a slow start, ran over the top of a Carlton side who has been renowned for poor second halves. So again, I don't know if I learned much from Collingwood, but so far so good, generally speaking. Sydney have slowly started to improve as well, with a big win over North Melbourne at Marvel, which I didn't see coming. So they looked a lot better and a lot closer to the Sydney side we might have expected throughout this year. It was probably their most polished performance, although there's an injury to Tom Papley, which has ruled him out for 6 to 8 as well, which doesn't help. But the other factor with this game is that it's a neutral venue at Adelaide Oval, and who plays Adelaide Oval better? I don't think I'm even really going to think down that line too far. I feel like Collingwood are decent in Adelaide. Sydney, I'm sure they haven't got a terrible record there, but they did have that game against Port last year. Probably apples and oranges comparing with this game. So this is just truly, who do we think is the better team? And I don't know. I feel like Collingwood probably has been the better team over the course of the season so far, but Sydney's last performance showed they might be finding some touch, finding some form. They were able to put away a North Melbourne side that, naturally I thought were a decent chance of winning that game. Analysing it simply by who's been better this year is not a good way to do it. As we saw with Fremantle and Western Bulldogs, I tipped the Dogs because I thought they were the better side this year, and Fremantle played their best game of the season to date. So that could happen in this game, and I'm not too sure in which direction it might go. So I'm a little bit iffy about this. I have a feeling Sydney could win, but I'm going to tip Collingwood based on the fact that they've probably just looked a little bit more assured. They've had one bad performance so far this year, and Sydney still have injuries. So I'm going to tip Collingwood by a measly 10 points. North Melbourne versus the Gold Coast Suns. This one I won't take too long to think about. North Melbourne were quite disappointing at Marvel against the Sydney Swans, like I just said. Fell a long way short, and I wouldn't say undid the progress they did at the start of the year, but it was definitely an off day where they slightly more resembled the team we've expected over the last few years. But it was just an off day, and I won't hold that too far against them. But this is a tough opponent. The Gold Coast Suns they're undefeated with a percentage of 172, and I think as much as any win this year, they have been validated by the fact that they just beat the Crows. Again, it was at home, but Gold Coast Suns are such a strong team this year, I think. Adam Simpson described it best. He said they've got such a balanced team, such a balanced midfield of players who can win the ball at the coalface and transition to the outside really well. They've got a fantastic ruckman, and now they've got belief, which is the scary thing about the Gold Coast Suns. So I think this is a genuinely tough opponent for North Melbourne. And Barossa Park, it's going to be a regional game. I don't even know where that is. But let's say the Gold Coast Suns should win this by a healthy 45 points, to be honest. I think they'll make it tough for what is still a young North Melbourne team. Look at this. Carlton versus West Coast, the blockbuster nobody expected, perhaps. Look, Carlton has been the subject... Well, both of these teams have been the subject of a lot of scrutiny for different reasons to start this year. So there is a fair bit of tension with respect to both sides at the moment. Carlton, for very on-field performances, they're 0-4, have been in front at half-time at all four of those games, if I'm not mistaken, and then second halves have been quite disappointing and fell away quite poorly once again against Collingwood. And, I've been, reading a lot of content, and their supporters are absolutely sick of it. By contrast, West Coast, we expect to be 0-4 at this point. Nothing surprising about that so far, with a percentage of 52. Maybe those margins aren't as tight as I'd like them to be, but, on field, not really a big surprise. They were pantsed by GWS on the weekend, but for the first time in a long time, West Coast selected the youngest team in the comp. So that just shows where they are. But there's so much negativity and scrutiny on West Coast for off-field stuff, namely around Harley Reid and particularly Oscar Allen at the moment. So both of these sides will want to come out and make a statement, I'm sure. But to be honest with you, I don't read into the fact that they're both 0 wins and 4 losses. Carlton have a knack for slaughtering West Coast, particularly when they're not necessarily expected to. Late last year, as an example of that, where they had about 17 injuries and they slaughtered West Coast. So I am not getting my hopes up. And as an Eagles fan, I think if West Coast are in the game at halftime, this could be close. But I'm going to say that Mackay and Curnow will have a field day, and I'm thinking a 10-goal win's about right. Western Bulldogs versus the Brisbane Lions. This one, it has the potential to be good, absolutely. The Bulldogs they'd be flat with their loss against Fremantle. I think they had 19 in sub-50s to 8 at quarter time, and were either all even or 1 point ahead or behind, I'm not sure. Fremantle hung in there and blew them away in the second term. Now, we know the Bulldogs have some injuries, but they'll be pretty flat with that performance, and then have to double that up by going to Adelaide after playing in Perth. So a couple of reasons to maybe doubt the Western Bulldogs going into this game, although I think the football they've played for the most part, considering their injuries to key players and absences, has been pretty solid. Now, the Brisbane Lions, the reigning premier, they're 4-0, and I wouldn't go as far as to say they haven't looked troubled. They've been challenged by Geelong. They're even challenged by West Coast to some extent. And I guess Richmond held pace with them pretty well, to be honest. So they're coasting a little bit, but they are still the best team in the comp. But there's nothing really to suggest that they're not at this early stage of the season. So this will be a tough ask for the Bulldogs to win. Are they capable? Yes, but I'm not going to predict it. I think the Brisbane Lions haven't really showed too many signs of vulnerability. If they have, they've made up for it in the same game. So I'll say the Brisbane Lions win by 15 points. Essendon versus Melbourne at Adelaide Oval. I believe this was the gather round game in 2023, and Essendon pulled off a big upset to beat the Demons, didn't they? So if my memory serves, Melbourne still made the finals that year. So there's a little bit of form here. Essendon beating Melbourne in Adelaide, the only other time that it's happened. Look, on the surface of this season so far, you'd have to say that Essendon has been the superior of the two teams. They're coming off the bye, of course, having played one less game, and they've beaten Port Adelaide. And I'm not too sure Melbourne would have beaten Port Adelaide on that exact same night. I think they've been quite a disappointing team this year. Held pace with Geelong a little bit better than I expected, but again, they still fell about 38 points short in the end. I think things are pointing towards a bit of a list transition for the Melbourne Footy Club. Don't get me wrong, I think they've been proactive in that space over the last few years, but the season is just about shot already, and it will be, even more so if they go down to Essendon. Now, Essendon, one of the youngest teams in the comp. Like I said, West Coast were the youngest team this year, but I think on average, Essendon have been actually the youngest team in the comp. They've claimed a win. I thought they were solid against Hawthorn and had a big loss to Adelaide so far. So, we're really splitting hairs a little bit between two sides that are not expected to play finals this year. I'd say Essendon's been better. I would argue that Melbourne have the better star talent on their team. So anything can happen in this game, but I think I'm going to have to tip the Bombers to win this game. I think they've been better to this point, which again is a flawed way of looking at it, but let's say Essendon by, let's go 17. Richmond versus Fremantle, again at Barossa Park, and look, Fremantle have found some form. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say they really found form against West Coast. Maybe over the course of the game they built confidence and grew into that a little bit, but a stark improvement against the Western Bulldogs. Weathered the storm early, the defenders held up. A lot of inside 50s they conceded and then just torched the Bulldogs in that second term and went on to hold on to a 3-goal win. So their best win in some time, I would say, since at least the middle of last year for Fremantle, and a huge stride in the right direction. So Richmond, look, they have beaten Carlton early this year, and because of that fact, we always have to consider that they could do that again. Since then, a couple of bad losses, and then last week managed to keep the margin against the Brisbane Lions to about 28 points. They ran out that game fairly well, although at times it did threaten to get a little bit worse. But nonetheless, you take that performance. So Richmond are not absolutely pushovers. Maybe if they have an off day, which has happened already this year a couple of times, they could get pantsed here. Their best version of them could probably make it close, but I'm not going to bet on that at all. I'm going to say Fremantle should win this by at least 6 goals, to be honest, and that's being conservative. St Kilda versus the Giants. This is another tough one. This is a bit of a toss-up for me too. I've definitely undersold the Saints. I didn't tip them against the Power. That being said, the Giants are a much different proposition than the Power at this current point in time. But they've been in great form, the Saints. There will not be easy beats here. It's just a question of, are they good enough to beat the Giants? The Giants have been mostly very good this year. A big start against Hawthorn where they're up by 6 goals at quarter time and then lose, but Hawthorn could be the benchmark of the competition. We don't know yet, but they look to be around that mark, right? So they lose that game by not too much. It was a decent battle. And last week we didn't learn anything. They just slaughtered West Coast with their transition game. We already knew that they're probably the best ball movement side in the competition, right? So we've seen them torch sides a couple of times this year. Collingwood was the other one. Now, is Collingwood better than St Kilda? I guess we don't know the answer to that. Maybe it's ballpark, so sure they have the capacity to do it. This is a neutral venue. I'm going to tip a thriller here, actually. I think I'm too much of a wuss to tip the Saints, but I'm going to say this is a real nail-biter, and we see the Giants win by 2 points. I just think they're a little bit too good, a little bit too mature for the Saints, and they'll be much tougher than Port Adelaide, but I would definitely give the Saints a chance. And here we go, a big game to finish gather rounds. In terms of narrative, we're naturally a rematch of that semi-final where Hinkley and Sicily and Ginnivan were all getting into each other. Look, I think things have changed a fair bit since then. I think Port Adelaide did a great job of winning that game. They had a few outs and Hawthorn had heaps of belief and Port Adelaide had a bad loss the week before, but it feels like that was a long time ago. Even in just a football sense, it was only 4 or 5 games ago. The Power have been really flat to start this year. A bad loss to Essendon, another bad loss at home to St Kilda, even though Jason Horne-Francis tried to lift them single-handedly over the line at times it felt there. So their one win over Richmond is all they have to hang their hat on for this season. And Hawthorn, you'd imagine, will be a much tougher ask than anything they've faced this year, to be completely honest with you. I wouldn't say the Hawks have been blistering to start this year, but perhaps our expectations are a little bit inflated by how exciting they were last year, and now it's sort of becoming the norm. They've looked like a good, solid professional team, and they're a bit more mature than they were 12 months ago, a couple of mature recruits, and I'm just trying to make the case, is there a chance Port Adelaide catch Hawthorn napping? I don't think I can bet on that. I think you'd be an extremely brave man to tip the Power. And I'm touching wood as I say that because I might just be setting myself up for a very silly comment there. But surely, most people are tipping Hawthorn here. I don't think the ground holds any fears for them. This game could be the nail into the coffin for Port Adelaide's season, and it's barely gotten started. And maybe we say that too much. Maybe it's me exaggerating that a little bit unintentionally because we've seen teams recover from that more in recent times than ever before. But 1-4 to start the year for Port Adelaide, and this would be 2 consecutive home losses. Surely not, though. I'm going to say that Hawthorn drives a stake through the heart of Port Adelaide season. Yeah, 36 points. I can't imagine Port Adelaide playing well. They just haven't given me any reason to think that they will in this game. So let's go to Hawthorn. All right, quick look through the ladder before we wrap this up. We've got Hawthorn, the Brisbane Lions, and Gold Coast as our top 4 teams. GWS in 5th. That probably is the 5 best teams on form we've seen this year. Collingwood in 6th. Sure, that makes sense. But again, that really depends if I'm right about them beating Sydney. I'm not convinced by that at all. If Essendon beat the Ds, they'll be back into 12th, despite lingering around the bottom 4 at this current point in time, I think. And Port Adelaide will be nudging that bottom 4 before too long. I'd imagine they won't stay in the mix for that part of the ladder. Carlton finally get a win. They move up to 13th. And the Demons, if I'm correct, will stay in the bottom 2 alongside West Coast, who will have to wait at least one more week for their first win, that's for sure. But let me know in the comments, guys, what do you think of my tips this week? What's your game of the round? What's the hardest one to tip? Or perhaps your upset of the round? There's a few things to go through there. Game of the round, I might actually say, surprisingly, St Kilda and GWS might be the actual best game this week. I'm not sure there is a contender really for upset of the round. I mean, Melbourne could beat Essendon, and there's a few 50-50s there. Could West Coast pull off a hilarious prank by beating Carlton? I really just don't think so. So I don't think there's too many realistic upsets this week, but I have, of course, been wrong before. And again, the hardest game to tip this week for me is Collingwood versus Sydney. As I tip Collingwood, I feel like Sydney's going to win, and I may live to regret that one. But let me know in the comments, guys, what you think, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.